Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this episode of Threat Talk. I'm your host, Bob Hansman, and today's episode is entitled, Do You Know Who or What is on Your Network? Part 2. Now, we ran out of time in our previous podcast, so we had planned to simply finish our discussion today. But the recent T-Mobile breach has been linked to an unsecured router as the original entry point, and that's changed up our discussion a bit. So Core Network Services veteran Bob Hansman, or Bob Rose, we get confused between everybody else. Now we're getting confused between us too. I don't know who I am today, but Bob, you've returned to help us dig into this, understand it, and understand how to prevent it. Is that correct?
Yeah, this was really quite an interesting story. Perhaps most of you or many of you have seen this. This came out actually August 27th, Wall Street Journal article on T-Mobile. T-Mobile, of course, is the second largest carrier. They've got 90 million cell phones on their network. And so if you're not familiar with the story, there's a 21-year-old American hacker by the name of John Binns, and he compromised T-Mo's 50 million customers using an undetected router. And according to the article, he reported T-Mo's security as being lax. And you can imagine if you're the CISO, that is a real challenge to deal with that. And in fact, this is the third breach in 2 years. And it's one of several very high profile breaches where personal customer information was stolen. And it's a pretty significant story.
Oh, definitely. And again, the reason why we're going to drill into today is because we spent all of the last episode talking about how important it is that, security people need to know what's on the network. Networking people need to know how security is using it. What used to be kind of a battle of who's going to win because, the security people are going to put some on, that's going to slow my network. Oh, the networking people aren't going to cooperate, so I'm losing out of my security battle. They used to fight, but now there's a great deal of synergy, which was what we were talking about last time. So this kind of like puts a big spotlight on exactly what we were talking about, particularly since it started with that router. Everything goes through the router. The router sees it all, and and yet that was still just the entry point. They then were able to move laterally around the network, and they didn't see that either.
Well, exactly. And once you get in, right, the challenge becomes great in terms of trying to lock things down, and that's why automated discovery and full visibility are really so important in today's complex hybrid on-prem and cloud environments, because you actually absolutely need DNS and DHCP activity and performance data. You need to get IPAM on-prem, and if you're in the cloud network discovery, especially utilization data in layer 2 and layer 3, along with endpoints, switches, and routers. And Bob, in the past, we've talked a little bit about discovery best practices, and it's really important to know what those best practices are, especially being able to configure granular data on individual devices to enrich your data set. Having a wide array of scheduling options to perform network discovery. IPAM data is so important, Bob. We've talked about that before, to get that seed router data without having to use CSV uploads, and having integrated workflows that tie directly into your DNS, DHCP, IPAM, hierarchical configurations to enable inheritance, especially from other networks. And companies still deal with updates that have blackout periods. You want to be able to configure those and then pull it all together in a single control plane so that you can see everything.
I want to back up just a bit here, because the first part here is that we're still trying to figure out if this was a router they even knew about. Now, you and I've talked about this in other cases where I've worked with, in the industry for years. Matter of fact, you work with AT&T, so you're very up on the specific challenges in a mobile network. But I remember working with Hollywood production studios, and they would have problems where they're going out on site. They're going to be there for 5 months. And of course, Big Star X has to have high-speed internet, so they'll set up a direct connection for them, and then somebody else wants it. Next thing you know, this remote lot has a lot of direct connections, but they've weaved it in somehow into the network, or there's ways for people to bridge from this non-managed or non-corporate managed network into the real network. They're using that as a vehicle to get in simply because they don't even know that it's there. I remember working at one company where we actually had a studio sue us because we had failed to detect an attack. And luckily, they were still on site. It was a remote European site. And we were able to send somebody out there on site, looked around, and they started noticing, yeah, they'd set up a bunch of these new routers through the local services, and those were connected, wired actually at that time. They were physically wired to the network, but they didn't know they existed. It was because they just couldn't keep track of that kind of equipment. And so at this point, we're still trying to figure out if T-Mobile even knew about this thing, because obviously it wasn't patched. That was one of the things that Ben mentioned, that, you know, the router was easy to get through with just published, available on the web's kind of vulnerabilities. So we didn't know, or we still don't know, if they even were aware of the device. It was so unmanaged, unmonitored. But even if it had been managed and monitored, this is where those best practices you were talking about really come in. That if you're doing things correctly, it can also give you a lot of data to know where did this thing go next. So that if somebody, like, let's just use the email phishing, because it is the most common way things happen these days. I get breached by a phishing attack. I click on a link and it takes me somewhere. Your routers at that point, you know, there's no illegal activity. It's a legitimate request, legitimate response, legitimate file download. The breach has happened. But knowing your DHCP, your IPAM address, and your DNS information would allow you to then identify what happened next in that attack, so that when you are doing your investigation or trying to figure out how many systems got infected, or in this case, one router was breached, but 50 million customer records were stolen. You know, how big did it go? There's a lot of questions you have to ask. And that's where those best practices come in. It's not just to prevent the breach. So number one, network discovery will let you know if you've got an unpatched device, if you have a device you don't know, and all that. But you're kind of taking it to the next stage, is that by having this stuff better managed, you can do so much more. It's not just a simple prevention measure.
Well, yeah, exactly. And you know, visibility is one of the key issues, and everyone has heard, if you can't see it, you can't manage it. And I think that's one of the things. Having best practices is really important, but you know, there are a lot of tools out on the marketplace today. As you look and you go, okay, well, we're using a lot of tools, but what's really important is to have something that enables you to do polling, whether it's regular periodic polling, or if you do some scheduling, maybe it's hourly, maybe it's, you know, daily, weekly, monthly, whatever the case is, to have that capability. Another tool that's out there that enables folks to apply their profiles is to have the ability to do inheritance, where you're actually inheriting a discovery profile from an existing network, or perhaps maybe you need to create a new one. But to have that capability is really important.
And I was going to say, that whole inheritance thing, that also helps, like, you know, DevOps, when they have to spin up a new server or take one down, and they want to make sure that it automatically has a security policy. If you've got some sort of a system that can automate that, then it actually makes everybody's job easier. So we're going, again, beyond just network management, but you're making SecOps automatic. You're helping DevOps get their jobs done faster without waiting on other people. By having profiles ready and prepared ahead of time, that's another best practice that just makes everything run smoother.
Right, exactly. I think another thing, Bob, that's really important is to have content-aware workflows. You know, in the security space, we have this term called contextual data, right? And to have the ability to traverse protocols and devices and ports and IPAM data with built-in and adjustable scheduling and parameters, so that you can see, you know, based on all of the latest real-time data, it's content aware. You can see exactly what's going on, knowing how the infrastructure devices, you know, knowing those intimately, the interface ports, the current port status, and being able to return to a network IP map attached to the port so that you can see everything. Like once it's visible and it's out in front, then you can do a better job managing it. And there's other tools as well, port control that give you complete IP addresses, DNS port assignments in a single workflow. And people are being asked to do more with less. And you have a limited number of analysts, security analysts, you have a limited number of networking folks. And so efficiency, and you mentioned the word automation. And I think that that's really, really important.
Well, yeah, and because there's the part of people not being, not having enough people, but there's also the speed at which we operate. Again, if all of a sudden somebody needs to spin up a web server in order to support, a new web server to support some new service or capability, that also means, okay, we got to make sure the security team has all of their policies at the gateway and on the network to make sure they're supporting it, that they know that it's there. But if you can automate all of that, I remember watching a demo that one of your SEs was doing it, and he spun up an entire web server in like 35, 40 seconds and had automatically the security policies were put on it. And then he said, and now we don't need it. And he hit a button and it was gone. And yet he did it himself. He on our corporate network, he never had to contact anybody in IT. He never had to contact anybody in security. Because they'd set up all of these methods and best practices so that he could do his job without always waiting on other people. And so, just we waste so much time, and we can't do that in the world of internet speeds.
Well, and that's so true. And I think, even though companies are modernizing their infrastructures and their networks, it's amazing to me how many people we engage with that have manual tools and processes that they're dealing with, and it's so how do you manage things that are happening at the speed of IT today with spreadsheets and manual tools? One example, Bob, and we've been talking here a little bit about tools, but if you had an automated network security and lifecycle management tool. Now think about this. This would be a tool that would be fully integrated with DNS, DHCP, and IPAM that would give you automated security and lifecycle management. So you get the contextual end of life, end of service, and security data, and you get these real-time security bulletins. They're like PSERTs. It's a product security incident response team report, or perhaps it's a common vulnerabilities and exposures alerting that comes up in real time that detects an obsolete vendor devices. So these are devices that, perhaps we've just touched on the T-Mobile experience, but perhaps it's an obsolete switch or router that's on your network that didn't get patched and you didn't know about it, and now it's a vulnerability point. And to be able to detect that automatically, to access reports across multiple vendors, and to really be able to get continuous updates so that major breaches like the T-Mobile event doesn't happen, and really you can sleep better, and most importantly, you stay out of the news.
Well, and I wonder how many of our listeners find themselves, they read in the news that there's this new active threat in the world and it's related to a CVE. That's the common thing that we're all looking for. And the first thing they wonder is, do we have any exposures from that? But if it's been automated, they may have actually been notified before they ever saw a writer write about it in the press. The CVE came out and they would have been notified ahead of time that, hey, you've got something that may be a risk. So the risks get exposed earlier, but they can't do that if all they have is their security information, their CVE feed or whatever. They also need the network information, and they need the access to the tools on the network. Some of those are going to be controlled by the networking team. Some are controlled by the security team. And this is where I keep getting frustrated with SASE. I really love the concept of SASE, so don't anybody take that out of context. But the thing is everybody talks about SASE like it's a thing that I'm going to buy someday. I'm waiting for a SASE tool. And it's really at its heart, it's about getting networking and security, people, processes, and tools to work together. Just some APIs that are available today. I might be able to take a networking tool and a security tool and connect them and have them working together. And all of a sudden I didn't have to buy any product. I used 2 tools and 2 products I already owned. I just wrote a script to use the APIs and connect them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is more of a convergence between network teams and security teams, and kind of a coming together, especially as security teams are going, hey, there's some great information on IPEM data that we need, and how do we incorporate that into our processes? How do we get access to that information in an automated way, real time, so that we can see exactly everything that's going on? So I think, you're touching on something that's really, really important. We're seeing that kind of coalesce and come together a bit more, but the challenges are certainly still out there.
Now, we talked about and started talking about the T-Mobile breach, which was because of a router, which possibly, we're not even sure it's one that they even knew they had. I know of cases where companies doing load balancing, they have a whole stack and a whole rack of devices. They add another one and they forget to do whatever the inventory process is. And next thing you know, somebody's lost control. They end up patching the others, but never that one. We're still waiting for details on how this happened. But these are all corporate purchase, managed, owned devices. We're also dealing with these new edge cases. Now, BYOD is not new. It's been around for a long time. IoT is not new. But a lot of corporations, particularly with the response for people having to work from home, they've started doing a lot more IoT and BYOD integrations. And again, these are devices that are also getting missed in inventory, particularly BYOD. I buy a new phone, I take it into work. Do they realize that I've connected to the corporate network, which I'm allowed to for certain things? I'm not like a guest forced on the guest network with my BYOD device. I'm on a different wireless network. But, how do they know that I'm the same person that I was because my whole phone is new and my whole device is new? And do they even know I'm there? This discovery thing that you were talking about, that's big, particularly when it again comes to, now we're not talking about networking and security teams. We're talking about the building management people just put in a new automated system and it's connected to the network. And somebody needs to know about that.
Well, yeah, and there's all sorts of security issues around BYOD. I worked for the largest carrier for 5 years, and the big concern was, okay, so you're bringing your own device and you're getting into our networks, but what happens if you forget and you leave it at a restaurant and somebody is able to access it and get into it, or in one way or another you've lost your device, or you need to be able to track that. And I think the challenge that we come up against is there's so many diverse smartphones that are out there, so many diverse devices that you can bring and connect to the network. How is a security team going to be able to know all the different operating systems, all the different types of devices, and be able to protect all of those? And you need to be able to kind of elevate above the fray and be able to detect everything, and that's really a challenge.
And I want to interject here, because there's also the phone is definitely in tablets. Those are number one. That's the most prominent by quantity. But there's a lot of other side use cases. I talked to a customer a few years ago. They were in New York, and because people were really getting concerned about monitoring their children in daycare, some of the daycares were offering, here's a device, you can take this with you, and at any time you can see, because there's cameras and you can watch your children playing in the rooms. You can see everywhere in the facility so that you always can have eyes on your child. And this one company realized that an employee had brought one in. People looked at it, said, oh, that's interesting. More employees brought it in. The only reason they noticed it was because their bandwidth got sucked up by all of their employees getting these streams. but it was because they didn't even know the devices were there. So, this BYOD is not just a phone issue. People need to realize there's a lot of other things going on.
Well, yeah, and IoT is another important one. The five leading IoT industries that are out there are manufacturing, transportation, utilities, healthcare, and cars, consumer electronics. We've seen that, a proliferation of that. And I think I mentioned on our last podcast that there was a large oil and gas company, for example, and they have on-prem remote valves, flow control, programmable logic controllers, telemetry, a host of all of these different oil and gas chemical devices and machinery, and they have to be on. Like, they just have to be on. And so visibility, redundancy, resiliency are all critical. If any of those go down, recovery speed and continued ability to make change are essential. And it's really important to be able to have that. And this was proven when a hurricane knocked a refinery and chemical plant offline. DNS, DHCP were unavailable for communications, and it was a big effort that cost them millions of dollars to just get their operations back online. And Bob, there are a number of interesting statistics that are out there right now. In 2021, there's more than 10 billion active IoT devices. But by the time we get to 2030, it's estimated that that's going to be 25.4 billion. And there are a number of sources that are out there that can collaborate that. And also by 2025, they're saying that 152,000 IoT devices will be connecting to the internet per minute. And the big problem, as we've discussed it, is lightweight devices just don't have robust onboard security to prevent from becoming a compromised access point. And that is really a concern, especially as more and more things are connecting to the internet.
Well, and we're hearing that about applications that are finding more and more vulnerabilities because the programmers of those applications don't build security in. There's a lot of topics that I'm afraid most of the people listening to our podcast who are security people, they're aware of it. Unfortunately, you go to the group of this, software developers, and it's a much smaller group who really feel the need to build in security and use, because there's a lot of tools out there that can help them. Just scan your code and say, hey, you've made a couple of common mistakes that you may not realize, that when you do something this way, it can create buffer overflows. It can, the way you're forming your script calls could actually create, problems there. They'll help find vulnerabilities. There's so many tools just at the code level. Now you take it up to like what you're talking about, the device level. That manufacturer of that device, they take a look at, if we spend 5% of our budget on security, are we going to make that back in sales? Nah. So it's really the rare company that makes that investment. And so most devices, exactly like you say, they go out and they are just full of security holes because it was not a concern. Even if they thought about it, they didn't prioritize it.
Yeah, but those companies have to realize that, those are clearly security vulnerabilities, and whether or not they want to spend the money, they're being forced to. Right now, we've seen an increase in wearable devices, for example. Those are expected to increase more than 1.1 billion devices worldwide, and employees can actually quickly update work, and even updates in real time when they're on their device and suddenly they're connecting to the network. And there was a survey done by HelpNet Security in 2020. 63% of organizations are worrying about data leakage, and another 57% are worrying about downloading unsafe apps or viewing unsafe content. And mobile devices, clearly, as we've noted, can be an attack vector. And that's certainly something to really be concerned about. And especially, there was another report that said 87% of businesses depend on the employee's ability to access mobile apps, but 72% of the companies that were surveyed lack a plan to secure the BYOD. And so whether it's IoT or BYOD, that's an ever expanding threat vector that's got to be managed. And it's one of the best practices to be able to put your network data to work for you so that you can detect it, you can see it, block it quickly, and remediate any kind of security threats.
Well, I don't want to take this back on the discovery side. So I'd mentioned the example of what if I buy a new phone and bring in, fortunately, Infoblox does monitor, and they'd know if I bring in a new device to connect to the network, and I will be contacted because I have been. But there's a lot of companies that don't know what's going on. And you mentioned the oil and gas, and I know manufacturing, steel processing. While I was going to school, I actually worked at a steel mill where everything was computerized. But, in all of those situations, they have people out on the front lines who all of a sudden, a conveyor belt's not working, an air filtration system in a mine's not working. We're getting faulty data back from this one pump on a fuel, system or out on an oil rig. And they just pull out that device and plug in a replacement device, everything's, I don't want to say plug and play, but it's rip and replace. Is the way these modules work. It's kind of like your car. I remember when I used to go fix and just change the light bulb in my dashboard. The last time I had my dashboard lights go out, they had to open up the dashboard and replace the whole unit because they don't do it at the light bulb level anymore. And that's the way they're repairing these remote systems. So back at HQ, the security team, they may not know that a new device has been plugged, a replacement installed, or maybe they're expanding it and they're putting in new ones, but they don't know that there's now a new unpatched device, IoT, on my network. And this is where that discovery piece comes in. So I know you've mentioned it a few times, but I really want to make sure our audience understands that there are tools out there that can, to avoid, conflicts. You've mentioned that, to avoid, just flooding the network with all these pings. They can do a non-intrusive audit and do that periodically to identify those kinds of changes.
Excuse me. Yeah, absolutely. And the ability to kind of sync the data across your systems. One of the things that really helps with that is having open RESTful APIs and purpose-built kind of off-the-shelf templates that allow you to use your integrations that you already have. And so those are a couple of things as well, when you're talking about tools, when you're talking about discovery and availability. But a lot of times it's also integrating with the ecosystem, because how difficult is it to go out, oh man, do I have to go out and get another solution? When we already have solutions, it's a matter of integrating with those solutions that are already out there, using kind of best of industry, best of breed solutions. How much more value, how much better ROI do you get if you're able to use your existing stuff and simply connect to it using APIs? And that's where a lot of the DevOps teams come in and can really add a lot of value to be able to connect all of that together.
Well, great. And we are at the wrap-up time. One thing we never talked about is that for anybody who'd like to drill into this more, Bob, you did a webinar recently that really goes into this whole discovery piece a little bit more. You want to let everybody know how they can find out about that or find that webinar?
Yeah, I think we're going to be sending out a link. This is Infoblox webinar on visibility for hybrid networking and security results. And just a really, really good webinar kind of summarizing some of the things around DNS, DHCP, IPAM, and how you can use that data and integrate that in your security solutions. So watch for that. That's a really good webinar. Gives you an overview and gives you some insight as to how you can use core network services in a security context.
All right. Well, the podcast is delivered through a lot of different platforms. Most of them will support it, in which case we will provide a link to this in the description with the podcast. So thanks, Bob, for coming back for this second session.
Great to join you as always, and perhaps we can get together and talk again sometime.
Oh yeah, I've got a couple of things I want to bring you back for in particular. So, but thank you for your time. And I'd like to thank our viewers and listeners for your time. Join us next time as we continue our efforts to help you stay on top of cybersecurity and ahead of cyber risks on Threat Talk.